Good morning, everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. As Christina said, my name is Chantal Alatorre, and I am a senior planner with East Bay Regional Park District. There are a few of my colleagues from planning, stewardship, design, and construction, and also operations here with us, in addition to one of our board of directors, and I will be introducing them after my opening remarks. So I'm going to take some time to just provide you with some background of how we got here and why the Park District decided to initiate this regional study. So here at the Park District, we have a dual mission to preserve a rich heritage of natural and cultural resources while also simultaneously providing access to open space, parks, and trails, with, of course, the greater focus and purpose of providing safe and healthful recreation and environmental education. We know that our beloved parks and trails are not immune to the threats that climate change pose, and are reminded of that when our shoreline parks become inaccessible due to flooding. We also know that as a land manager, we need to take inventory of our assets and how they are vulnerable in order to be proactive in responding to the threats brought on by climate change. Next slide, Christina. So with that awareness, the Park District decided to take a step back. And instead of planning for climate hazards on a park-by-park basis, we wanted to look at it through a regional lens with the intent of showcasing what we at the Park District could adapt and what we needed partners and allies for in order to advance the work and the science. The Park District's trail system comprises over 1,250 miles of trail, including over 40 miles of bay trail along the East Bay shoreline, as you can see some of the area in the graphic shown on your screen. And so what we realize is that in order to continue to fulfill our dual mission of preservation and access to open space, parks, and trails, we needed a tool or a document that would guide us in this process by defining what our vulnerabilities were, where they posed a greater threat, and how soon we needed to adapt to that site, and also who we needed to work with in order to make all of this happen. So as we were having these conversations conveniently in 2018, we were thinking about this regional approach. Also, Caltrans opened up the application period for their SB1 adaptation planning grants. And so we applied and were successful. And with that grant funding, we were able to begin this process, which is what we will be sharing with you all today. Next slide, Christina. So as I'm sure you can all relate, COVID-19 hit us like a curveball. We were forced to adapt and to a new way of life, and parts of this project also needed to be modified. In January, when we were beginning to discuss the public and stakeholder engagement process, we envisioned sharing project information in person at different community events and festivals along the shoreline to have more of an in-person interactive experience and learn more about how you saw the Bay Trail and how you used the Bay Trail. But of course, 2020 had other plans. So instead of in-person forums, we come to you digitally. Today, you will have the opportunity to ask questions through the chat feature, as Christina mentioned, and we will answer them in the order that they are received during the Q&A portion. If you think of a question later, after you've had more time to digest all the information that we will be sharing, I welcome your comments through the project's website or in an email to myself, and all those details will be available at the end of the presentation. So you'll have my contact information and the website link. So now to introduce our team. Joining us for the Q&A portion of the discussion, we will have Brian Holt, our Chief of Planning and GIS. Brian, if you could give a wave. Okay, I don't see you, but I'm assuming that you're waving. And then we will also have Ren Bates, our Capital Program Manager. Also joining us, we have Jeff Manley, our Shoreline Unit Manager from Operations. I believe we also have Christina Kelchner here, our Assistant General Manager for Acquisition, Stewardship, and Development. And then also on the line, we have our board, one of our Board of Director members, Director Coffin. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to Poonam Narkar, who is the Project Manager on the Prime Consultant Team, WRT.
Thank you, Chantal. That was a great framing of the project, the intent, and the context for how this project was initiated. So with that, welcome again, everyone. I'm Poonam Narkar. I am with WRT. We are the lead consultant on this project, and I'm the project manager on behalf of the entire team. I would like to begin with introducing the consultant team. We have here today Christina Bejarano, who you heard from earlier in the presentation, a landscape designer and planner on this project, who's behind a lot of the wonderful, rigorous analysis that you will be seeing very shortly. We have Diksha Rawat, also an urban designer with WRT, who is instrumental in creating graphic communication and a lot of the analysis work as well. And then we have John Gibbs, principal in charge with WRT, a landscape architect, brings years of experience working on public space and park planning work and similar projects as this one. In addition to WRT, we have a great team of experts on our team. We recognized early on the various complexities that this project was going to involve, and we are very happy to have this team of experts that we have been working very closely with. We have our design partner, ESA, who are leading the ecological systems design and coastal engineering, bringing coastal engineering expertise. And we have Louis White, and all of you can wave or show who you are. We also have San Francisco Estuary Institute, who brings the base science expertise and the work, the huge volume of work that they have already done on developing the adaptation atlas and around resilient landscapes. And we have Julie Beagle, who is leading that effort on this team, and also with SFEI. We are joined by RAAPP, who is leading the risk assessment and climate adaptation work on this project. And this work was led by Jack Hogan, who couldn't join us today, but we have Krista Cassidy from RAAPP here, who will be available to answer questions as well. And then lastly, but not the least at all, is On Climate, Alexis Robert from On Climate, who is leading the very important work on this project around funding and implementation and partnership strategy, which is going to be a very, very important aspect to get these projects off the ground over the years. Next. So, as Chantal framed earlier, the Park District was really they took a regional perspective at this project. Although the scope of this project is focused on the Bay Trail, we couldn't look at the Bay Trail in isolation because the issues that and the impacts of sea level rise are beyond just the Bay Trail. And this project and this initiative was really an opportunity to look at a number of different issues. Some of the ones that rose to the top were looking at ecological impacts, public access, access for recreation, access to the shoreline, and vulnerability related to sea level rise, of course. But at the same time, as Chantal pointed out earlier, really an opportunity to identify what partnerships can be established and what partnerships and collaboration and coordination is required to continue this work beyond this project and beyond the scope of this project. Next slide, Christina. So with that understanding, we developed a project approach that took a broader view, a big picture view of the entire shoreline, and we started with really gaining an understanding of what the conditions are that we are looking at. We looked at inundation scenarios due to sea level rise. We looked at the land use patterns along the shoreline and demographics. We looked at the ecology along the shoreline within the geography of the project. We looked at critical infrastructure, which is also really important, and transportation network that are along the shoreline, and of course, very importantly, economics. And then we had some discussions with the Park District team, and the Park District really helped us identify some selection criteria to look at, to focus and hone in on selected segments for risk assessment. Again, within the scope of this project, although ideally it would have been great to do detailed studies at the entire shoreline scale, we had to very quickly start prioritizing what we were focusing on. And taking that in, so we identified 8 trail segments to conduct the risk assessment that RAAPP led. And you'll be hearing more about the outcome of the risk assessment later in the presentation. From the 8 trail segments, we then applied again certain prioritization criteria, which really were about risk reduction and a priority for risk reduction to those segments. We took into consideration the Park District goals, and we also considered the funding feasibility and partnership potential to have some of these pilot projects that we could, or early starter projects, and that helped us prioritize 3 sites that we will be focusing on to develop some adaptation strategies. And all of this work then eventually is going to be it's going to culminate into a report that presents the outcomes of each of these analyses that we have conducted at the various scales. There will be a broad guidance at the shoreline scale, and then there will be some more specific guidance for the focus areas. Next slide, please. And this is a summary of the project goals that we established with the Park District, and these 9 project goals have really served us to prioritize trail segments for the risk assessment, and eventually also for the focus areas. And these will continue to remain fundamental as we develop the adaptation strategies as well. Next slide, please. I will now hand over to Christina to go over the analysis that we conducted at the shoreline scale.
Great, thanks, Poonam. I might go back one slide just a second. Let's see if I can do that easily. Yeah, just we wanted to emphasize that the project goals that we developed with the Park District was one of the ways that we were able to begin our analysis, right? So because of course we first took a deeper dive into understanding all the coastal hazards and how they affect the shoreline, but we also went through and got a sense of what habitat restoration, what the potential for habitat restoration might be, how the adaptation could be designed in a way that it focuses on like a nature-based approach, right? So that was fundamental to a lot of the work they were doing. So I just wanted to emphasize that before diving into a lot of the series of maps and analysis here. So habitat restoration, the understanding of some of the maintenance issues that the Park District is already starting to see along the shoreline, the adjacency to critical infrastructure, adjacency and ability to serve some of the disadvantaged communities that reside along the shoreline. Of course, access to nature. We talked about funding and partnership potential, how some of the projects could align with the master plan goals, and then at the end of the day, how the projects that we highlight could represent a diversity of different conditions, so that the document could provide a broader guidance for the park district in general. So diving in here, in terms of coastal hazards, of course, we considered how tidal inundation would change over time due to rising sea level. But we're also looking at how that affects and impacts the change in temporary storm flooding. We took into consideration the different wave conditions that exist along the shore, and looked as well at the understanding of how shallow groundwater would start to impact some of the areas along the shoreline. So this is a summary of those things, starting with 0 feet. Here, looking at 3 feet, you can start to see a couple of the segments starting to expand and showing the impact. And then at 6 feet here. And we have these on the website as well if you want to go back and look a little bit more closely. I mentioned the understanding and the importance of understanding the habitat restoration potential along the shoreline. So with this analysis, we relied really heavily on information and work from SFEI and support from ESA to have a sense of what's there today, and based on elevation and other ecological conditions, what the potential might be for habitat creation or migration that could happen along with a bay trail adaptation project. So we sort of assigned an understanding of that potential for each of the segments in the analysis. We talked about critical infrastructure. So some of the segments you'll see are near the airport or near wastewater treatment plants. Of course, Caltrans is an important partner through a lot of these projects. Yeah, at the overall shoreline scale, you can just see that there's a lot going on and really emphasizes the importance for coordination and partnership with these agencies. And here we're mapping, using Cal and Bioscreen, we're mapping the disadvantaged communities and their proximity to the trail segments. So as you can see, there's again a great opportunity to provide public access and just equal access to the shoreline to a lot of the folks along the shore there. So all of that overall analysis folded into a risk assessment, which was led by Jack Hogan and Krista Cassidy, who's on the call, as we mentioned, from RAAPP. A big key part of that, I guess I can show you here, a key part of that was really understanding those overall hazards, what that meant in terms of exposure at each of the at the mid-century and end-of-century conditions, and vulnerability associated with that. So, but what I guess an interesting finding from that was, or a new approach, I should say, was to understand shoreline armament, not only looking at whether or not there's riprap or a hard edge, but also sort of taking a new understanding of what sort of protection do marshes or natural features along the shoreline provide. So we fold that in, and we're able to expand that definition a bit through our analysis, which I think was interesting and new for us. So through that selection, what came out of that analysis was a selection of these top 8 at-risk areas. So we call them sites, but they're actually a bit expansive, and I'll walk through what those are. So you can see them as they're distributed along the shoreline here, and how each of those segments was ranked and scored in order to really just to summarize a lot of the in-depth analysis that we were doing. And the results of that were that Mlk, Mlk Shoreline, Alameda Point, Coyote Hills, and Hayward were sort of grouped together, but that area, the area around North Richmond, East Shore State Park, the Spine Trail segments, Crown Beach here in Alameda, and Miller Knox are really some of the top sites that will be considered in terms of requiring a clear adaptation plan going forward. Part of what that told us, and part of why we were trying to group these and by sort of a ranking of priority, was that the next step in this process for us is really to provide some guidance and some specific design ideas for 3 sites. So we'll talk through what those are, but basically it's Mlk Shoreline and Alameda Point and East Shore State Park. And part of the reasoning for that is that there's a lot of great planning already happening at the Hayward Shoreline and at North Richmond. So we're using the resources of the team to support some of the other areas that need further research as well. So I will hand it over now to John Gibbs, who will talk about those focus areas and how we're moving forward.
Hello, webinar attendees. John Gibbs from WRT, and I'm just going to pause here. Chantal spoke to the Park District's goals for this project, really understanding their lands and understanding the Bay Trail, and how to operate this incredible resource that is the Bay Trail, that is our shoreline, for future generations. And I think hopefully you've also seen, as Poonam and Christina described the analysis and described this process, there's critical infrastructure, there's incredible habitat of regional value. We're working through at least 12 cities. We're working between 2 counties. And there's a lot of complexity out here. And to solve for multiple benefits really requires a broad approach to partnerships. This is not an instance where the Park District can save us all along the East Bay shoreline. And as our adaptation planning dialogues really around the Bay and certainly around the state and the nation really have recognized is the great importance of governance structure, the incredible importance of partnerships in order for us to solve for these multiple objectives: our underserved communities, our access to nature, the protection of aquatic resources, of natural habitat. To implement adaptive nature-based solutions really requires the coordination between agencies, between jurisdictions. And the benefit that's going to come from this is a better protected shoreline, something that's sustained in the long term, and that provides the flood protection that we're going to need moving forward. So just really want to emphasize this. This is really the expertise of Alexis Robert and on climate, who you're going to hear from, I think, during the Q&A, of just how we begin to weave and position these areas and the Park District for a position of coordination with many different jurisdictions. And we're going to see that as we dive into the 3 top sites and as we begin to move forward. So Poonam and others have described this overall process. We're now grounding ourselves really at the close of this project, where we're now kind of taking all the lessons learned and beginning to think about them on a site basis. While 8 sites were identified as even the highest priority and 3 were selected, all of those 8 are really important to the Park District. With the available resources, we're tackling 3 of them at a preliminary state. So Alameda Point, we're looking at it probably in the greatest level of detail. There's some great partnerships already in place out there and some great opportunities to move forward perhaps with some of those adaptive strategies to move forward with some implementation of some public access. East Shore State Park really focuses in specifically on Schoolhouse Creek and there at what's called the North Basin Strip and along the edge of the Berkeley Meadow. And then the Mlk Shoreline, really looking at that at the highest level, some key trail gap closures along Doolittle Drive, but we recognize so many different jurisdictions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that one in just a sec. So jumping right in to Alameda Point, here we are at the far west end of the Alameda Island. It's part of the old airstrip, and there's a section of the property which is proposed for public open space, publicly accessible lands. This area is really not very accessible today, so this is really going to be a pretty incredible new place to walk and to experience the views across the bay over to the San Francisco shoreline. It's also really cool to look across the channel at all the shipping containers. You're standing out at the edge of this enormous airfield. It's a really powerful place that we're going to be able to bring public access to and to protect and explore this adaptive restored environment. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk through at a high level just what are some of those key design goals. So the real impetus here is to bring public access along this shoreline with an extension of the Bay Trail through the site. And in terms of understanding its impacts of sea level rise, which we're going to show in just a few minutes, it's really important to think about that trail as an adaptable feature and something that perhaps could migrate. In the same way, we would need to understand habitat creation and to a degree habitat restoration out here. This is all an area of fill, so really in historical terms, we're thinking about habitat creation and how is that habitat able to be established today? It lasts through mid-century sea level rise, and think about it in the long term as well as an adaptable habitat feature. As we bring folks out here, this is an incredible opportunity to learn about those sorts of systems through interpretation, through education, features along the way, as well as just watching this area change over time. Lots of permitting paths that will be involved in this process, and we want to align to those in advance so that this project is very compatible. It's also very fundable, we feel as well. And we recognize that, as part of this area of change with sea level rise, it's also just incredibly impacted by wave action. There's a very long stretch of shoreline to the west, extending all the way out towards Alcatraz, and there's a lot of wave action. And so ESA, as our coastal geomorphologists and engineers, really have work cut out for us, work for them, understanding those impacts. Speaking to the partnership side of this equation, so we certainly have the city of Alameda and the base reuse folks. The VA will be operating and establishing a really important hospital medical facility, as well as some columbarium components out here at the former base area as well. So the really important coordination with some of our federal partners. And somebody in chat even mentioned the Port of Oakland. And while we're not within the Port of Oakland, there's there's certainly some adjacencies there. So I think, yeah, they're definitely on our list as well. Through the city of Alameda, there are underserved communities, and particularly in the nearby western portions of the island. And so this public access really does extend back and ties in with a lot of other goals for extending public access to some of our underserved communities. So that's a little bit of a high level, and we can kind of go to the next slide to talk a little bit more about then some of those key issues that we're seeing. So, first and foremost, in the areas of light blue are, excuse me, the dark blue is areas of permanent inundation at a 3-level sea level rise scenario, with additional areas of lighter blue indicating some of the storm surge and the storm inundation as those storms blow in. We're going to see additional areas that are going to be inundated. So this really starts to tell us where areas of habitat could be more easily established, but also how we need to begin to protect and understand the adaptive strategies for trails and for marsh areas. So the next slide goes to a 6-foot sea level rise scenario. So it's beginning to think a little bit more long term, closer to end of century. And really we see that the entire area is quite inundated. And so that not only affects our park area that's shown in red, but it also really begins to affect neighboring areas. And so this idea of partnerships and coordination between jurisdictions, becomes very obvious as a requirement here. Also, how do we preserve that public access over time? Are there boardwalks that are established in the near term, and then those boardwalks could actually begin to migrate further back so that we're revisiting this park in another 50 years for its second phase? Where do we build a more permanent position and essentially a line in the sand that allows marshes to migrate, but up to a point where things are preserved and set in place for an end of century scenario? These are all some of the questions and some of the things that this team is working on. So we're going to shift over to the next location, and this is Schoolhouse Creek in East Shore State Park, and here adjacent to the city of Berkeley. So East Shore State Park and the Bay Trail extends along the I-80 corridor and along the bay and the Berkeley Marina. Obviously well used, well loved, and in some ways well planned through the East Shore State Park General Plan. Has really set in place those areas of conservation like the Berkeley Meadow, and really important and very rich habitat, and that's very well studied and supported, and with a lot of really important stakeholders. The general plan identifies the North Basin Strip, so really the narrowest part of what's showing on screen next to the Gilman Fields, is an area that can handle some additional recreation and public access, both public access to the shore, public access to the water in terms of kayaks, has identified the daylighting of Schoolhouse Creek, and all of these things done within within the very important lens of conservation and the enhancement of the natural features. So with that guidance in mind, we're looking to how can we reestablish, or how can we create better shoreline access, and in fact allowing the Bay Trail to move away from the freeway and the frontage road as you get further to the north, bringing that out to the shoreline area, and then extending north all the way up around Gilman Fields and up to the Albany Beach, but also connecting with a better connection over to Cesar Chavez Park as well. And so, that Bay Trail experience is certainly first and foremost. We have disadvantaged communities within the area of Berkeley that is adjacent here. So we're actually, this is an important project for better public access, but also our targeted communities as well. Restoration is first and is a incredible component here of this project, and again, understanding restoration and trail components in a way that can be established today, and that can be sustained, and that may be adaptive as we look over time. There's one significant focus that I think elevates this regionally. Schoolhouse Creek is a perennial creek. It extends up to about Spring Street and up into just above downtown Berkeley as a culverted drainage. Daylights out here into the bay. It's not unlike Strawberry Creek, not unlike Cordonisus Creek, not unlike a lot of our other urban creeks that connect to the bay. And if you begin to think of all these together, there's really starts to be some, perhaps a powerful story of these habitats that exist all along the East Bay shoreline. And this is not just, this is one of them, but part of a much larger system. So there could be some interesting lessons learned as we go through this process, both understanding the habitat opportunities, the shoreline geomorphology, but also the relationship between urban creeks and sea level rise and upstream flooding, which becomes pretty important as we begin to move forward. Lots of collaboration and partnership goals, both with the City of Berkeley, with Caltrans, as well as so many of our ecological stakeholders, from Save the Bay to Friends of East Shore State Park, Sierra Club, that are all very interested in the habitat opportunities here at East Shore State Park and Berkeley Meadow as part of that. So looking forward, we're beginning to see now some of the impacts of sea level rise, both within East Shore State Park. We're also beginning to see areas of urban flooding as it relates to rainfall events. And as you know, as the sea begins to rise and the pipes, those drain pipes begin to fill with water, we also see potential for greater flooding upstream during rain events. It's not coastal flooding, but it is associated with rainfall. Just want to be clear about what we're showing up in the on the east side of the freeway. That's a rainfall event. But as we start to see these future impacts, that also begins to speak to the need for coordination. City of Berkeley has been very forward-thinking with their green infrastructure funding and programs, and so there's opportunities to tie into that as this project begins to move forward. So key opportunities are the daylighting of the creek, working with ESA, really thinking about shoreline conditions that could be designed here to be adaptive, but to also reflect back to the historic shoreline here, what was here before we began to fill the bay a century ago, that was really fringe beaches and then these back bay areas. And so that sort of a system could be appropriate as we begin to move forward. And we'll probably hear from Louis White and Jorgen Blomberg from ESA as we go into some of the Q&A. Great opportunities to think about this as a connected habitat with the Berkeley Meadow, with the Basin Strip, with the North Basin open water, and the daylighting of Schoolhouse Creek, to think about that all as one ecological unit. As we mentioned, we got to be mindful of sea level rise and the adjacent urban areas and that urban flooding component that really might inform some of the work and some of the opportunities between the various agencies. Shouldn't be lost on all of us that the freeway is right there and is that kind of critical infrastructure, really could have an impact or could be an influence on long-term design goals for this area. So the third area that this plan is looking at, again at a very high level, is the Mlk Shoreline, and in particular, it's some gap closure of the Bay Trail along Doolittle Drive. You can see in the photo here the airport just on the top of the screen. You can see areas of Bay Farm and Alameda Island on the right side of the screen, and Arrowhead Marsh, really a significant habitat feature within the Mlk Shoreline area. Incredible avian populations, rails in particular, occupy this marsh. And as we look ahead in time, we're definitely aware of great impacts to sea level rise, but I think the story here is really about the opportunities for partnerships. And so the next slide just begins to map out who might be some of those partners. We kind of reoriented our view here. You can see the yellow indicates the Doolittle Drive Bay Trail gap closure. So we're thinking not only about a trail, but we're really beginning to think about marsh systems. And I think the work of SFEI around the Bay and some of their ongoing thinking about the importance and sometimes the relative importance of different habitat components around the Bay, might really draw some additional attention and some additional guidance to habitat opportunities within the San Leandro Bay Mlk Shoreline area. As we begin to look forward into some of the sea level rise maps, I'm going to also kind of then make the point about partnerships. So between the Oakland Airport as I think an obvious critical infrastructure to our region, are there opportunities to think about multiple benefits, to think about habitat and the protection of perhaps some of the most important habitats around our bay located here, to critical gap closure of public access of the Bay Trail, and the protection of critical infrastructure such as the Oakland Airport. And how might we tell that story and to position all these various agencies and jurisdictions towards greater benefit and a greater system of governance in the future. That's kind of the extent of our work there. Certainly things get worse as we look in the longer term, and we hope that these maps are a telling story and a call to action for a lot of our regional partners. Poonam, wrap us up.
Great, thank you, John. So next steps from here, John really nicely highlighted the importance of the various partnerships and coordination that will be required, and our immediate next steps are going to be reaching out to some of the stakeholders that we identified for these 3 focus areas. In fact, Chantal already has reached out to some of you who are on the call, and we are looking forward to having some conversations around challenges and issues, and then brainstorming some ideas together. And once we wrap up our conceptual ideas for adaptation strategies for these 3 sites. As I mentioned earlier, all of this will be documented into a report. And what this report really is, this is going to be a guiding document that highlights both regional scale issues as well as site-specific challenges. And there will be guidance for broad guidance for adaptation strategies that are nature-based. We will be identifying certain conditions along the shoreline, and the adaptation strategies for those conditions will be touched upon at a high level. And then we will get a little bit more specific with these 3 focus areas and really explore some nature-based adaptation strategies, or a range of adaptation strategies that make sense for these 3 focus areas. And most importantly, also along with that, it will include a strategy for partnerships, and all of the work that Alexis is leading that is going to be an integral part of this document. So we are looking at a final document to be wrapped up by February 2021. So it's close, just around the corner. So look out for that early next year. And I think that wraps up our presentation, and we are opening the floor for Q&A. I think Christina will go over some of the logistics of the Q&A, but we encourage you to continue. Some of you already have done that, but those who haven't yet, please type in your comments or questions in the chat window.
And Christina, I see a really good one teed up here, really about partnerships. And using Doolittle Drive as perhaps a good example and a segue.
Yes. So Lori asks if the Park District is working with Caltrans, Port of Oakland, and City of Alameda to raise Doolittle Drive and or the Bay Trail to provide flood protection for the airport in the city. So that's a big part of the beginning of the conversation that we'll be having with those stakeholder groups, certainly. And I don't know, John, if you wanted to add a bit more.
And
I think,
Christina,
yeah.
I can, Brian Holt can answer and speak to this question if we're ready for that.
Great.
Yeah, I think Brian speaks, and then I think it'd be great if Alexis maybe could just kind of add a little bit more flavor to that too.
Yeah, thank you. Brian Holt, Chief of Planning, Trails and GIS for the East Bay Regional Park District. The Park District currently is working on closing the gap on the Bay Trail at Doolittle Drive to bring it to Martin Luther King Shoreline, to the Shoreline Center there. So that's sort of I guess that would be the southern stretch of it. The northern stretch, the Park District actually doesn't own property in that area. So we're certainly interested in working with Caltrans and the Port of Oakland and City of Alameda, see what sort of plans that they come up with, and certainly hope that we'll incorporate the Bay Trail and whatever future conversations happen about any management of the Bay Trail and that sort of thing. But really looking to see Caltrans and the Port take the lead on actually raising that highway.
I would just echo what Brian says, and from a funding and partnership standpoint, we look at this area as involving a lot of potential partners, Caltrans, City of Alameda, Port of Oakland, City of Oakland, and it's possible that the East Bay Regional Parks District could play a bit of a convening role around this question that, of course, opens up a lot of other questions beyond the Bay Trail and into the protection question that Lori, you raised. So that's something that we'll be focusing on a lot, but we'll be mindful of how many partners are involved with this and longer term decisions that it affects. And welcome suggestions from City of Alameda and others of who from Alameda and from these other agencies that we've mentioned should be involved in that conversation, because I'll be following up with key stakeholders individually as we go along, and welcome those suggestions either as a private message or in the group chat, or you can email me. I'll put my email address in the chat right now. Thank you.
Great. And I'm just reading Stacy's comment here, question. So we've named access for traditionally underserved communities as a key issue. This access was discussed in the context of Berkeley, but can you share more about how this is being discussed and addressed for Oakland, where there's much higher density of these communities? Yeah, great point, Stacy. And the overall analysis, if I were to point that out, of course, there's a big overlap with what's going on the Coliseum side, for example, and some of the other areas here in Mlk Shoreline. Yeah, I think the planning overall for the San Leandro Bay overall will certainly connect with those groups. I think for the focus of the Doolittle Drive segment at the moment, it's maybe more focused at a higher level in terms of providing that cap closure. But happy to if anyone else from the team wants to elaborate on that answer. I think right now, yeah, it's an understanding that there's an important access issues, but as part of this project, we'll mostly be identifying that issue and talking about the coordination needed to think about the Doolittle Drive cap closure. So.
I guess if I could, just to sort of add on to answering Stacy's question regarding traditionally underserved communities, just understanding that this is what we're looking to is sort of a prioritization and implementation plan, but there's a lot of other regional efforts that are going on throughout the Bay, including Adapting to Rising Tides, led by BCDC, the Bay Conservation Development Commission, and just different discussions that are tackle some of those broader regional questions, and that's really central in those conversations as well. So I think it's a lot of it's embedded in these conversations that we all recognize that that's a really key goal of any of these efforts.
Yeah, great. And Karen's asking where the public can view the information on some of the areas we've identified. So I have, and I can copy it into the chat if it's easier to note down, but we have the project website has a link to a story map that shares all the analysis maps and documents what we've done so far. So if we can go there, and also, if you have any other questions, we have the comment form on the website, or you can email Chantal directly, and she'll coordinate the Q&A with the broader team. So let me just highlight it. Maybe not. I'll put it in there in just a moment. There we go. Thanks, Chantal.
All right. There's some shyer people out there today. I'm just wondering if, oh, here we got one from Jesse. And otherwise, I was going to see if Julie from SFEI or Louis White and Jorgen Blumberg from ESA, they would want to use this opportunity to chime in as well. So let's take Jesse's question, and maybe some other folks can chime in.
Yeah, great question from Jesse about, he asks, can you expand a little bit on how to use the RAAPP if we're working on a project that's outside of your 3 priority areas, but has the opportunity to adapt to the Bay Trail? And yes, that's a great question. So as part of our final document, we'll also be providing a section focused on broader guidance for the overall shoreline. And I don't know, Louis, if you wanted to sort of describe a little bit about how that might be used and the goals for that.
Yeah, thank you, Christina and Jesse, for the question. That is pertinent to one of the things we're working on right now, which is to outline a what we're calling a broad guidance for the East Bay Shore, specifically for the Park District to use to inform how to integrate adaptation approaches for areas along the Bay Trail and the shore that can look at using. So basically, I'll give you an overview. What we're thinking about is taking the SFEI's work on the shoreline adaptation atlas, which I'm not sure if you all are familiar with, but taking that, which document, which an analysis which identifies, possible adaptation measures focused on natural system restoration approaches, nature-based approaches, and then looking at the specific regional hydrology and geomorphic conditions that may support different types of nature-based approaches. And so we're breaking up the East Bay Shore into different segments and looking at the types of geomorphology that exist and how those may respond to sea level rise, and then identifying the adaptation measures such as, say, marsh restoration or a horizontal levee or coarse sandy or gravel beaches, and describing those in a way that make it a bit more regionally specific to different segments of the East Bay Shore, and giving guidance on how those might be integrated into the planning for adaptation. It's similar to some of the work that's been done for the Open Coast that was part of the recent climate updates for the state, where the Nature Conservancy looked at natural infrastructure guidance. So what we anticipate is identifying materials and the conditions that may be pertinent to those different adaptation measures. And then similarly with that document, we wanted to just identify possible trail-specific adaptation approaches. So that would be focused on what is the tolerable level of flooding and inundation on a trail. At what point, what conditions would trigger adaptation, and what would you do about it? Would you put it on some sort of causeway? Would you retreat and relocate the trail? Would you raise it or protect it with some sort of hybrid structural or natural approach? So we have those two things that we're looking at doing. So I don't know if anybody has any questions on that. Feel free to, I can keep talking about it, but I think it's a good place to stop.
Thanks, Louis. I wonder, Julie, if that's a nice segue over to you to talk about just SFEI's role in the project in general, and how we've been applying some of the lessons learned from the adaptation atlas.
Sure, thanks. And that was a great description, Louis. So, our role has been to kind of infuse the work of ESA and RAAPP with an understanding of shoreline resilience from an ecological perspective. And so one of the things in Louis', what he just laid out, we also added in information about current conditions of marshes, beaches, upland migration zone potential. Some of the areas are eroding currently, some are prograding or moving out into the bay. And so we tried to document and add into the risk assessment, what's the risk to the ecological conditions as they are today, and what do we expect will happen in the future. The Adaptation Atlas looked at opportunities for nature-based infrastructure today, and I think one of the ways that the team is moving that forward is thinking about what are the opportunities moving forward if we want nature to play a key role in the way we adapt these shorelines and the Bay Trail. And then the last thing I'll say is that one of the ways that we're moving the Adaptation Atlas forward, which I think is going to wind up being important in how we think about prioritizing parts of the East Bay shoreline outside the three specific sites that John and Christina and Poonam talked about, we're looking at not just what the physical and geomorphic opportunities are, but what does that mean for wildlife? And that, because our clapper rails and salt marsh harvest mice and salt marshes in general and the habitats that they provide, coarse beaches provide another range of habitats for species. How do we prioritize, which ones do we need to save, which ones do we need to build out? We're looking at a wildlife connectivity model right now across the bay, but also looking at the East Bay in particular, and trying to understand moving into the future, if we implement a lot of these nature-based solutions that we talk about in the Adaptation Atlas and that this SF Bay Trail RAAPP is moving forward with, what are the benefits we get? So for example, does Arrowhead Marsh, is that the most important place that we need to save? Is that a critical stepping stone between the South Bay marshes and the North Bay marshes? And trying to prioritize the value for wildlife we get from these pockets. John mentioned this early on. Some of these areas are really small, but what we're finding is that if you look at wildlife connectivity across the entire bay, these stepping stones are critically important moving forward. And so we're trying to infuse that type of information into the prioritization and thinking that the team is putting into these documents. And I'm happy to answer other questions about that, but I'll stop.
Thanks, Julie. If we have any other questions or comments, we can wait a few more minutes here. I know we have until 11:30, but no problem to wrap a little early if we covered it all.
Maybe I'll just jump in and say one more thing, Christina.
Great.
And that is that one of the reasons, or one of the goals of the funding and partnership piece of the report will be to identify partnerships or groups, agencies, nonprofit groups, et cetera, that could at some point collaborate on grant seeking together. As many of you know, more and more state agencies and other grant providers are looking for a collaborative approach that involves a number of different stakeholders and can show multiple benefits. So I think rather than have the East Bay Regional Park District go alone on a grant proposal, by looking at the range of stakeholders that could benefit from some of these adaptations, we could be looking at a narrative that would cut across a number of different benefits. Social in terms of disadvantaged communities' access to the Bay, or even protection against flooding, as we saw in some of the areas in Berkeley, businesses that could be interested, as well, of course, as the ecological benefits and ecosystem benefits that would be provided by those adaptations. So again, as I solicit groups that could potentially be interested in these 3 projects and who I should be reaching out to as potential partners, please think about how those could feed into collective efforts to seek funding from state, federal, and other sources. So thank you.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thanks. Chantal's been doing a great job leading this project, so really appreciate all of her efforts and all the efforts of just all the staff and the consultant team here. And on behalf of the East Bay Regional Park District, thank you everybody for your interest in the Park District and interest in the Bay Trail. And this will be unfortunately an ongoing project for us all as we try to tackle these very difficult challenges. So look forward to tackling it all together.
Here's to the Park District for leading the way, breaking the ice. So thanks to you guys, just as a citizen.
And just in closing, thank you again for joining us. And remember, if you have any questions after this presentation, or if you want to review the presentation again, it will be available on the website that was dropped in the chat, which is the project website. So if you have any questions after today, feel free to leave them on the comment form in the website or email me directly.